Welcome to the Tier 1 People podcast, FinTech Game Changers. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins. And in this episode, we've got a very special guest, David M Brear, CEO and co-founder of 11FS. David's going to share with us his insights on how to build a winning culture, how to bootstrap successfully, and he's even going to bust one or two startup myths. David, a lot of people would know 11FS for the Fintech Insider podcast, but there's a lot more to the business than just the podcast. Would you be able to share with us a little bit more about what you do?
We've been up to a few things other than just sort of hanging out with microphones and doing podcasts and whatnot. So, over the last 3.5 years, we've built a bank out for NatWest in the UK, a challenger SME bank, which has been called Metal, with a lady called Alison Rose, who's now the CEO there. We've done it over in Hong Kong with both WeLab and Standard Charter. Down in Singapore with our good friends at Grab, a number of different companies in South Africa. We're midway through building out a retail bank over in the US. And really, what we struck on sort of 3.5 years ago was kind of a thesis that really was so early in this cycle. The promise of actually everything that the internet brought to an industry that fundamentally hasn't changed for 300 years was to really move to much more of a personalized one-to-one relationship. Digital was really about using all of the power of the data to create much better experiences, much better services for people. But unfortunately, the way in which big banking organizations have really implemented that was fundamentally just about taking people and paper out of the process. It was all about digital being a justification, digital transformation program being the ROI, all being about taking cost out of the organization. And really, it's only been over the last 3 to 4 years that actually digital fundamentally has been about creating better services, better experiences for people. And that's predominantly led through major changes globally that's happened both in the regulatory space, but also the competition landscape fundamentally changing. New players coming into this space, whether it's fintech or whether it's massive technology companies, who are really showing that people just want better services. If you provide good capability to people, then you find that actually they're much more loyal, they have much better relationships, and actually they're probably much more forgiving when things go wrong. So from 11FS's perspective, we sort of live by the mantra that digital banking is only 1% finished. And then actually, our mission fundamentally is to change the fabric of financial services. And we do that in many different ways. We're on one side a services business, working with people around the planet, whether it's regulators or banks or tech players or whoever, to build out new greenfield things, to define strategy and move those things forward. And on the other side, it's about building products that actually solve problems that we've had ourselves, whether it's things like Pulse, which is a global benchmarking tool, or whether it's things like 11FS Foundry, which is a core banking system with full stack architecture.
David, is 11FS backed by VC?
We've taken no money. So I always kind of like to blow the horn for bootstrapped companies in that space, because actually my mindset on this is, from I think it was month 3 of the organization, we were profitable. I'm pretty old fashioned. All of this sort of pre-revenue nonsense is definitely kind of not for me. Organizations should be, I don't think you can call it a business unless it makes profit and makes revenue. So yeah, call me old fashioned on that one. But for me, it's all about, if people really value what you're doing, it's something you should be able to monetize.
So what are your secrets to getting a business off the ground without funding, David?
If I'm honest, I think if our history, I say history in the briefest sense, given 3 years, but we've got a few moments through 11FS where we've been, I think, really maybe very, very lucky, probably a little bit ballsy to really try and get people involved in things that we'd never really done before. The first sponsor of FinTech Insider, one of our podcasts, we had no listeners and hadn't done anything and no idea how we were editing it, but managed to get a sponsor because they believed in the thing that we believed in. The first client of Pulse was brought in as a partner. The product didn't exist before they did it, but they they bought into it. And I mean, I should say DMB invested in Foundry when Foundry was just 11 slides. It wasn't anything more than that. So, I mean, these things are really, I think at this stage, people invest their effort and their time and their money in things that they believe will be materially beneficial to them and the industry. And we've been lucky to find people who are probably as crazy as us and share some of the vision, which is awesome.
Coming on to that and talking about talent, you've managed to attract some incredibly talented people to the business, particularly in this last 12 months. What do you put that down to, David? And have you got any secrets you can share?
I think it's been interesting. I mean, I always think, I think this is why I think entrepreneurs, I mean, I'm 39 years old now. I was about to say entrepreneurs kind of a little bit older can do this probably more effectively than people who are starting out a lot younger, because I think building up a network of people who you've sort of gathered through your career that you're like, I don't know when, but we're going to work together again. I mean, I met Jason Bates, who was a co-founder of Starling and Monzo back when he was at Starling. I was still at Gartner, and we sort of came into contact. And I mean, it was one of those things where I know people kind of don't necessarily believe in love at first sight type thing, but I knew with Jason we'd work together at some point. Similar with Ryan Wareham, our COO. When I was at Lloyds Banking Group, I worked with him when he was at LBI. And you sort of get a feel for people in terms of actually the types of relationship, the things that they're really, really strong at doing. And then at the point where you actually got that opportunity to work with them, very similar conversation with Ross Methven, who was one of the other founders of the company when he was at Mapper, and we worked really, really well together. So actually it's just collecting people who you've got an understanding of actually where their skill sets, where their strengths are. And that's the starting point. I mean, beyond that, I honestly think it's like, I mean, success is fundamentally about momentum. I mean, once you can get that boulder going, then, one success leads to another success, which leads to the sort of magnetic thing that you can pull together around a brand that actually sort of does things in a different way. So, at the beginning, it was tough. It was hard to get listeners to podcasts. It was hard to get, people to come on the podcast. It was hard to get a client to do a piece of work or to get in a foot in the door to do a thing. But I mean, a few success things, and actually those things, whether it's good work or whether it's great talent, just become a magnet for one another. And I mean, there's a few people that actually said we were mentored at the beginning who actually are very interested I mean, Lida is a really good example, actually. I mean, I spoke to Lida Glucktis at the beginning of sort of setting out 11FS, and she said, it's lovely, David, it's a lovely idea, but you're crazy and it'll never work. And, I felt very smug 2 years later to come back and go, hey, okay, so it's working. Do you want to come get involved now? Because, and I mean, the rest will be history, I'm sure, but it's good. I think it's, you do a good thing, you kind of ladder that up to the next thing that you do, and then just use that momentum and the sort of magnetic nature that success brings to bringing other people in. And it's gone from that to, we get hundreds and hundreds of applications for roles, and, lots of kind of good inbound from people to really either help in a partnership sense or work with us or for us.
So have you found that the podcast and the branding has been a good tool, not just for talent attraction, but also bringing in new business and clients?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the beginning of the company, you're 5 people sitting around a table trying to figure out how you can compete with Accenture and McKinsey and these guys. And, we couldn't outspend them from a marketing perspective. Those guys have got hundreds of thousands of people. They've got more marketing budget than I think we would possibly know what to do with. But really what we decided to sort of outfight them on was just brutal authenticity and a level of distribution that actually would create a fundamental different way of actually engaging with the customer base. I'm not sure even now, 3.5 years into 11FS, we could spend the amount of marketing we'd need to reach the amount of people that we do with the level of content marketing that we kind of put out. And from my perspective, we focused so much on brand because I think when you look at all of the things that we put out from a narrative perspective, it's very much not really about our products. It's not about what we do. It's fundamentally about what we believe. And I think if you can align with people on either your belief system or your aspiration about what the industry could be, then actually you find the level of connectivity that you start to get with people to be fundamentally different from what it would be if you just put out some, bullshit brochure about actually how good your product was. And I kind of think that, again, we sort of set ourselves up to be, how can we be authentic? How can we be provocative? How can we, really establish human connections with the brand? Which is why it kind of feels like the hard work has really been done. We've sort of pushed hard now to establish a global brand and an element of success that has kind of brought us in whatever sort of micro level that it really sort of is right now. But now, really, for us, it's kind of just leaning in to fulfill the potential that we've sort of created for ourselves, which is exciting. It's every day is a new task and a new issue to kind of face into in some form or another. I sort of describe ourselves. I'm not sure if you know the quote from Jurassic Park, where they describe themselves of having all of the problems of a theme park and a zoo at the same time, but we've got all of the problems of a research company, a media company, a technology firm, and a consultancy all sort of rolled into one. And that's a wonderful thing, because all of those things are really opportunities to sort of do it in the way that people haven't done it before, which is really, for me, the thing that excites me.
It's really interesting that you say that, particularly when you consider the usual advice that anybody gets in a startup is that you should focus on one thing and do it really well. Would you say, in your experience, that that's perhaps not the best advice?
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's bad advice, predominantly given by VCs. The idea of just focus on one thing. When they say that, what they really mean is just focus on that one thing that I invested in your company to do, and don't get distracted from that thing that we're paying you to do. From my perspective, when it's that's like it's like a supermarket just selling one product. That doesn't make sense, right? If you want to be successful, you need to diversify. You need to have, smooth peanut butter and crunchy peanut butter, right? Because different people have different preferences in terms of what they have. From my perspective, it's like sensible spread betting. Really what we did was, we didn't know, 11FS wasn't set up to go, we have this one product idea and we're going to do this one product. It was set up really to create an environment, a culture of a business that actually would unleash the potential within the people who actually worked there. My frustration working at places in the past was that really the things that inhibited people from doing the best work that they've ever done was actually not the inability to spend or having too few people. It was the culture within those organizations that actually prevented those things from happening. So from my perspective, actually, we've set out to build a company that allows people to do the best work that they've ever done in their life. Because if we can achieve that, and actually that 11FS is the pride of the place when they talk about their experience, whether it's through speaking thing they're doing, or whether they're interviewing for another job in another place, and that's fine as well. We want the 11FS to be the shining thing that they're proud of, because they will have done their best work of their life here. And for me, how we've set out is to do that spread betting approach, both from a will this thing work perspective, but fundamentally, if you look at the things that we've done, whether it's, consulting is a people business, right? The revenue from it can be quite spiky if you're talking about, whole scale greenfield building a thing. When it comes to things like Pulse is a subscription product. It works on an annual recurring revenue. If you look at Foundry requires 18 months of development with, one or multiple partners before you're getting into, more major scale annual recurring revenue. For me, this was an exercise in how do we build the business? How do we build a profitable business in the short term that pays for us to build a very profitable business in the long term? I think a big part of us being completely self-funded means we can make much more strategic decisions around how we go approach things, and actually almost the diffusion of focus being a benefit, really, rather than a negative, really. I'd say the first things we did to put money in the bank was speaking gigs. The speaking gigs paid for us to hire somebody to come in and start doing consultancy work, and the revenue and the profit from the consultancy work allowed us to build the first prototype of Pulse. And these things, to my point earlier on around the sort of snowball effect of success and the momentum that brings, revenue models for me work in that way as well. You don't just do one thing and do that forever and hope it still sort of still is relevant to the market. You've got to continually be sort of pursuing good ideas and moving and shaping, if nothing else, really, just because actually the market kind of responds to you. I mean, when we first started doing 11FS, the market was very different to 3.5 years later in terms of all of the changes and all of the innovations that have come to the market. And that's the beautiful thing about this industry. It's just changing so quickly and moving so fast.
It is. In fact, when we speak with CEOs, we would say that the pace of change is probably the thing that freaks them out most. Coming on to that, David, is 11FS your first time as a CEO?
Yeah, I mean, 11FS is my first stint as CEO, really, which is good. I mean, I've worked for some really, really good ones. I've worked for some really, really bad ones in the past. I'd say I'd probably learned more from the really bad managers and the bad CEOs that I've kind of worked with than the good ones, if I'm honest with you. Same with the environments that I've worked at, if I'm honest with you. I find, again, our sort of slight chip on our shoulder of having worked at places where things weren't always perfect means actually we've got something to improve on.
And as a leader, what's the culture, values, and overall philosophy that you're trying to bring into the business?
My sort of philosophy on sort of leadership really is we deploy a lot of servant leadership. We are not in any way, shape or form a hierarchical company. We sort of believe that bad and good ideas can come from anywhere, whether it's bad ideas coming from the top or good ideas coming from sort of anybody across the organization. Trust is like a huge thing from my perspective. I think if you've got kind of trust both upwards and downwards in terms of people around the business, and that kind of breeds to a presumption of positive intent through everybody in terms of where we're at. I should say, I mean, my background is less. Before this, I ran Gartner's global digital banking practice and done various things in sort of banking and insurance and sort of consultancy sides of things. But honestly, I wouldn't really sort of consider myself a businessman. I'd sort of say I'm more of a sports guy. Right. And we bring a lot of the mentalities of sort of very successful sports teams into what we want to sort of pursue with 11FS, really. This isn't about... And if I'm honest with you, I think there's a real honesty to sports that actually is often very much kind of missing within the business context. There's many organizations that kind of can't really move quick enough or be as transparent as a sports team would be. I mean, if somebody's playing badly on the team, they know and really quickly. And actually, you'll do everything you can in a sports team to increase the productivity of the team, to increase the impact from an individual perspective. And actually, I mean, with sports teams, it's as much about psychology as it is physiology. And I think a lot of these things are very much kind of missing in the business world. And I'm often sort of reminded when it comes to sort of management, there's a really good quote from Nigel Clough, where they've just got, I think Nottingham Forest have just got absolutely spanked. And he knows that the 11 players coming off the field need completely different communication. Some of them will need to know that it's the best game they've ever had and they were hard done by. And some of them will need a kick up the arse and nothing else. Some of them will need literally no words at all because they know what it is that they need to do. And I think if you can kind of take that approach, which is, I think good managers, good leaders really understand that it's not really about them. It's about what it is that they can do to get the best out of everybody else around them, whether it's creating a sense of urgency, whether it's creating a vision and reinforcing that of where we want to get to, whether it's giving people kind of a level of motivation to run through walls that they wouldn't have really dared to do before. All of these things really come down to actually you need to understand what it is that motivates your people, not really just what it is that motivates you. And again, many people forget that. I think particularly when it starts coming to, really big corporate organizations, it actually stops being about really getting the best out of the people and actually starts just becoming about managing a board or managing a group of shareholders. And that's where I think you start to see a real change in the productivity of the people within an organization. And unfortunately, it's where you start to see almost an unrecoverable position from a cultural perspective in those companies as well.
And do you think being bootstrapped has given you the freedom to be able to implement all of these different ideas?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if we had a board who was asking lots of probably sensible questions, we probably wouldn't have been as brave or as stupid as we have been to try as many things as we did. But I mean, the beautiful thing about when you spread bet and don't put all of your eggs in one basket, when all of them hatch, you're in a really good place. And we've been very, very, very lucky with 11FS. The timing was perfect. We've just got some beautifully talented people. We've been, again, very lucky with the sort of context of what's happened. But I'm a big believer that you very much kind of make your own luck in this world. We work super, super hard, and actually, I think we've tried to do something in a way that just people haven't done before.
Thanks, David. That's all really great advice there. We've got some questions now from some of our listeners, and the first one's from Madav. He's a big fan of the FinTech Insiders podcast, and he wants to know if there's ever been a time in the 11FS journey where you felt like quitting, or you felt like there was a challenge that was too big to overcome. And if so, what was your mantra to help you get through it?
Honestly, never. Yeah, honestly, never was there a moment through 11FS that I felt like it was too much, or that I felt like quitting on it. And I think it's honestly, I think that's down to the team. If I'm honest, I think if you kind of look at the people that we've got in place, I really don't feel like there's anything that we couldn't really face into. I think we've got a real great amount of transparency and honesty across from our management team, meaning that there's nothing that actually collectively this team couldn't face into. So no, I mean, I was very sure we could make this successful before we even started. And if anything, I think probably my biggest the biggest criticism anybody can ever have for me is that I have an unrelenting amount of positivity for the opportunity that's ahead of us. Meaning that I had absolutely no doubt that we would have been competing with some of the biggest players on the planet. And actually, if you kind of look 3.5 years in, 3.5 years from now, I've got some pretty big aspirations of where we want to get to as well. So, I mean, if I took time out and thought about it too much, I think that's the bit where I'd probably start just getting a bit daunted by the scale of the mountain that we're scaling. But from my perspective, there's never been a second that I've thought anything other than this being a huge success.
This question's from me, David. So, what does the M stand for in David M Brear? I'm not anal about too many things, but I'm really anal about having the M in there. So the M stands for Michael. I have had a couple of people suggest it stands for money because it's been like a reinforcement thing, but it's definitely not money. It's definitely Michael. And I was named after my dad. So unfortunately, my dad died of lung cancer when I was 19. And the reason I'm sort of really anal about having that M in the middle there is just a kind of a constant reminder of him and the great sort of foundations that he sort of gave me. I think between my mum and my dad, they very much gave me my work ethic and my sort of value of money, my approach to life, and having that sort of constant reminder there of dad for that just gives me that extra edge to kind of not give up. If I'm honest with you, I think it's amazing the sort of the length of a shadow that he casts, having been gone for so long. But actually, from my perspective, it's just a nice constant reminder. We've got another question for you, David, and this one's from Jackie. It's a rather poignant question, and that is Australian banks' trust is at an all-time low. What lessons can we take from the UK, and what would be your advice to Australian banks to restore trust with customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, the hard thing about trust is, I mean, you can distrust somebody until you actually do something about it, it doesn't really matter. I mean, from the bank's perspective who are listening to this, like the great thing is the public have a really, really short-term memory. I mean, if you look at some of the things that have happened in the UK with people like TSB, you had major meltdowns, people kind of, all sorts of terrible things kind of were happening. But actually the amount of people that actually left that bank, left that organization was very, very minimal. The sort of peak of the financial crisis in, mid 2008, then actually we're in a situation where I think it was only I think it was the media industry who were less trusted than bankers. Those was literally people wiretapping and phone tapping people that were less trusted than bankers. But actually, I mean, given all the stuff that they've done, given the fact that they've spent a hell of a lot of money on above the line marketing, they seem to have got themselves back into the rankings when it comes to trust. What I'd say for the fintech industry, the Zingers of the world over there in Australia, actually this is an opportunity to use those messages. I think very much if you look at, it's hard to create a new market, but if the market that you're entering into, the incumbent organizations have, real sort of dents in their armor, then actually using that to your advantage when it comes to your positioning in the market and going after those guys. I mean, if you look at how Pepsi did Coke, Pepsi really sort of rode on Coke's branding to really establish themselves in that market. And actually many of the challenger banks could do that, I think, a lot more proactively. It's one thing creating yourself in your own sort of fashion, but actually doing it in comparison becomes really sort of intoxicating when you're looking at doing customer acquisition. I think there's so many people who are just frustrated with, both the behaviors of the incumbent organizations, but I mean, fundamentally just the level of service that they get. I always say it's reasonably ironic that the industry working is called financial service, because the lack of any service in some organizations is just absolutely shocking. I mean, if it was a restaurant, you would stop going to it, right? If it was any other walk of life, you would stop using that product. But because you have really no choice, and for a good 50 years, a couple of generations didn't really have any choice but a big incumbent organization. Almost the public were lucky to be blessed to be given mortgages and loans and all of these different things. And now that's very much moving, very much the power of choice within the market to change how the business models works, and the level of expectation that people can kind of have for the competition. For me, if I was a new challenger bank over in Australia, I'd really be using that to my advantage.
And our final question for you, David, and this one was the most popular one by far, is when will 11FS be launching in Australia?
I mean, I should say right now, I think we've worked pretty much everywhere. Every big sort of landmass, we've done something. I think the sort of appeal, if you really look at the appeal of what we've sort of stood out to do with 11FS, then actually we've very much been kind of that dog whistle to the really frustrated organizations that really believe that they can do it in a different way. And because of that, we've been very geographically dispersed. We've done work everywhere, Australia included in that. But really I'm talking to you now in our office in New York, because actually we're finding loads of really interesting, really big bits of work to do. So certainly if there's a really big, interesting, big bit of work to do over in Australia, then that sounds like a really good reason to set up an office at that point. So get in touch if you've got that thing, and then we'll build an office for sure.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thanks so much for sharing the 11FS story. We wish you and the rest of the team an absolutely incredible 2020.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me on.
That was David M Brear of 11FS with some incredible insights. Thanks for listening, and make sure you subscribe on Spotify or iTunes. And if you're looking for game-changing talent, you can find us at tier1people.com or email us info@tier1people.com.